see all of you here. My name is Dr. Vince Houghton. I'm the museum's historian and curator. Some of you I know, some of you are meeting me for the first time. But I'd like to welcome all of you to the third part of the International Spy Museum and Smithsonian Spy Seminar Series 4-week focus on the spies of the American Revolution. The first 2 weeks centered on fairly well-known personalities. You have the Culper Ring, which has an entire TV show dedicated to it now. And then Ben Franklin is, of course, Ben Franklin. And next week, we'll take a look at the most infamous spy in U.S. history, Benedict Arnold. So the relative obscurity of James Armistead Lafayette, the man we'll hear about today, is actually what will make this morning so interesting. He is someone we should know more about. His impact on world history is well known for historians, but historians are just now beginning to piece his life together, to find out new information, to understand his impact on the revolution, and to figure out how he fits among the great heroes and villains of American intelligence history. So Kate Gruber will help us begin to understand who this enigmatic man really is. She has been the curator at Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation since 2013. She is a member of the curatorial team responsible for the research and development of exhibits in the forthcoming American Revolution Museum at Yorktown, which she'll tell you more about today. Between 2009 and 2013, Ms. Gruber worked at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, where she assisted with the development, research, and production of the Foundation's electronic field trip series, served as a John D. Rockefeller Jr. Library Fellow, and most recently was Associate Digital Content Specialist in the Digital History Center. Although she's a public historian and museum professional interested in early American consumerism, economy, and material culture, and how these aspects of colonial life translated during the American Revolution, she considers herself an interdisciplinary historian, as we all try to, with experience in archaeology, architecture, museum studies, preservation, and quantitative and digital history. So without further ado, Kate Gruber.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, great. If you need me to speak up a little bit, just somebody wave their hand in the air. How about now? Any better? Okay, great, thank you. All right, let's get started. Who has been watching a lot of this lately? All right, I guess it's pretty popular. I have to admit, I've never seen it. I'm about 10 years behind on my own popular culture, so I'm still watching a lot of this. I figure I'll get to turn at about 2023 or so. That depends on if we get this new museum opened up. So, how about either one of these? Surely you know these guys, although I'd argue that one of them does not belong in the same picture. Or perhaps this is more your speed? And what about her? Well, if popular culture is any indication, tales of spies and espionage have always captured our imagination. There's just something about the romance and danger of covert operations, secret identities, quirky gadgets, code words, and agent numbers, invisible ink, Savile Row, and fancy cars, and of course, martinis shaken, not stirred, which I guess it's a little too early for right now, but maybe a little bit later. Well, thanks to our culture's fascination with the world of espionage, both past and present, these elements all seem to be part of our collective consciousness of what it means to be a spy. Thanks to Hollywood, I think that we all have a pretty good grasp of what spies look like and the jobs that they do, and the fact that they have to be a little extra careful when selecting a stick of gum, because when is a stick of gum ever just a stick of gum in any of those movies, right? Well, with popular culture running rampant with fictionalized accounts of espionage, it's important to remember that there are real historical figures behind all of this fiction. Men and women who risked their lives in the line of duty. These are real people with real lives and real stories. And I'm here today to tell you that as entertaining as all of this fiction is, the real truth, the real American history, is even more fascinating than the fiction. And that's a big part of our mission with the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation and the galleries and educational programming at the new American Revolution Museum at Yorktown, which is a 22,000 square foot permanent exhibition, which will open on October 15th in America's Historic Triangle. Let me say that one more time. October 15th in America's Historic Triangle. Obviously, that's just one of my many shameless plugs that you'll hear from me this morning. And we tell the real stories of the ordinary people that lived in the extraordinary time before, during, and after the American Revolution. Personal stories unfold the real-life drama of the 18th century much better than anything on TV, I promise you. It's easy to take that for granted, and we often forget that real people like you and me lived in that extraordinary time and made life or death decisions without the benefit of the hindsight that we enjoy today. Their actions had consequences, for better or for worse. And because of the extraordinary actions of a very ordinary man, we're here this morning. Well, my lecture is titled James Lafayette, Double Agent. And after being contacted by the Spy Museum to present our museum's ongoing research about the slave spy James Lafayette, I thought that this title would be reflective of exactly the content that I thought I would be delivering to you today. As a curator at the new museum, I've had the pleasure of of helping to expand our museum's scope to include a variety of real-life personal stories and our exploration of the American Revolution. You see, James Lafayette, as I'll explain later, is an incredible part of our story at Yorktown, and we made the decision to feature him in our museum's inaugural special exhibition, a 5,000 square foot exhibit entitled Afterward, The Revolutionary Veterans Who Built America, opening June 2017. Thank you very much. You're a lovely audience. The special exhibit, which as I mentioned will open next summer, will tell some surprising stories about the veterans of the Siege of Yorktown who walked off the battlefield to create a new world. We knew that James Lafayette was an important part of this story, and so we knew we needed to do a little digging to get it exactly right. Well, 6 months ago, when I was contacted by the staff here at the Spy Museum to give a lecture about James Armistead Lafayette, we had in our hands the traditional narrative of James. Plucked out of his servitude by the Marquis de Lafayette to spy on Arnold and Cornwallis in the days and months leading up to the Siege of Yorktown in 1781, running betwixt and between enemy lines to deliver information to patriots, and being so impressed with James's ability, British General Charles Cornwallis sent James on his own mission to spy on patriots, where James then effectively became a double agent, feeding false information to the British, while keeping Lafayette abreast of the goings-on in the British camp. James was the perfect spy, an effective double agent only caught during the days after the British surrender, when Cornwallis himself ventured into the Patriot camp and saw James among the Marquis's entourage. "Ah, you rogue," he exclaimed, "you have been playing me a trick all this time." Well, this is the traditional narrative of James Armistead Lafayette, and again, that's the research that I expected to present to you today. And this is why the title of this lecture is James Lafayette Double Agent, but I must admit to you now, the research of these past 6 months, once we dug further and further into the real primary sources connected with James and his espionage, very little came to light to illuminate our understanding of his potential espionage for Cornwallis. Even after 235 years, this aspect of his life still remains shrouded in mystery. But I'd like to think that that's what any good double agent would want, don't you? So what I'll present to you this morning is every bit of corroborated, primary source-based research on his life and his times, including the time in which James was acting as a spy for the Marquis de Lafayette. So here's your mission, should you choose to accept it. I invite you to join me this morning as we explore the life and times of James Lafayette, Invisible Spy. So backing up a little bit, I want to tell you more about the history of this research project at the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation, where I'm a curator. We quickly came to realize that almost immediately after the Revolution, James was mentioned in countless tomes chronicling the activities of enslaved African Americans during the Revolutionary War. And his exploits as a spy for the Patriots have been recollected time and time again, more often than not with little to no documentary evidence or basis in historical fact. Like a 200-year-old game of telephone, the real factual details of James's life became muddled, misinterpreted, or just plain lost in the archives or in the fires that ravaged many of Virginia's colonial and pre-Civil War record repositories. So unearthing James's story had a lot riding against it, but thanks to generous funding, let me say that one more time, generous funding, and the truly awesome and inspiring research chops of some of our noted historians at the foundation, including Martha McCartney. She's not here with us this morning, but I want to take a minute and say thank you to her for all of her wonderful research. The Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation is pleased to hold the most comprehensive, primary source-based research ever undertaken about this enslaved spy. Oops, excuse me. There we go. I was hoping to save this incredible graphic of James's own signature for a big reveal later in this presentation, but I think it's important to address something here before we go any further. So please act surprised and incredibly impressed the next time you see this come up on the screen. No primary sources consulted for this research revealed that James ever referred to himself or was known as James Armistead or James Armistead Lafayette. It's our belief that the Armistead in James's name was added later by a biographer who assumed that he took the last name of his owner when he was enslaved. Because the name Armistead does not appear in any primary source connected with James, we've made the decision as a foundation to refer to him as he referred to himself, simply as James or James Lafayette, and that's how I'll refer to him for the duration of this presentation. So according to his own recollection, James was born around the year 1748, enslaved and owned by the Armistead family, by then well established in New Kent County. In 1654, New Kent became the 12th county created by the Virginia House of Burgesses, with its western boundary simply defined as the frontier. The Armistead family, who may have originated in what is now Hampton, quickly became leaders in the community and held offices such as wardens and vestrymen, were elected to the House of Burgesses, rose through the ranks of county militia, and ran mercantile establishments in and around the capital city of Williamsburg. The member of the Armistead family most closely associated with James is William Armistead Jr., born January 5th, 1754, the son of Colonel John Armistead II and his first wife, Agnes. Colonel John led an active public life. The Virginia Gazette reported his death, quote, after a short but painful illness. I don't even want to begin to think of what that might mean in the 18th century. But it praised John's for public service, adding that he embodied every public and private virtue which could render his life useful to his country. John left behind a considerable estate, of which his son, 25-year-old William, was named executor. A year later, in 1780, William advertised in the Gazette the sale of about 30 likely Virginia-born slaves, among whom are a good blacksmith and an excellent carpenter, as well as cattle, horses, sheep, corn and fodder, and sundry other articles, as we so often see, at the late dwelling of his father in New Kent County. Like his father John, William Armistead also led an active public life, contributing much to Virginia's efforts during the American Revolution. For all of our research, we still can't say for sure when James came to be owned by William. James, born in 1748, was 6 years older than William Jr., and while we don't know for sure, James may have originally been owned by his father, the late John II, or another relative. The Armistead family was prolific in regional, commercial, and mercantile operations and maintained their position in New Kent's upper middle class. Enslaved African Americans such as James could do much to serve a family the likes of the Armisteads. What's more, we've already seen through my big reveal that James could read and write. It's not outside the realm of possibility that Colonel John, William Jr., or other members of the Armistead clan who owned taverns, stores, and other businesses in the area would have taught James how to read and write. Literate, James could assist in one of the various businesses owned by the Armistead family. And if you're surprised to learn that the Armisteads may have afforded James the education to read and write, I'll add as a footnote here that this was not an uncommon occurrence in colonial Virginia, and that the Commonwealth did not pass legislation prohibiting the literacy of slaves until 1819. So regardless of how or when James came to be owned by William Armistead Jr., they were both uniquely positioned and incredibly well situated to meet the needs of Virginia during the American Revolution. You see, not long after the shot heard around the world, Virginia's Committee of Safety needed a plan of action to supply and support Virginia's troops in the now sanctioned war for independence. And those shots were getting closer and closer to home. For now, suffice it to say that by the fall of 1775, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, had more or less propelled Virginia to the patriotic cause. And in the words of the Virginia Convention, he hath made it necessary that an additional number of forces be raised for our protection and defense. But there is one small problem. In 1775, colonial Virginia had no standing professional army, nor any precedents for establishing one. Thus, the Virginia Convention met in Williamsburg to establish the means for funding a more regular army in the colony, enumerating the terms for organizing up to 6 regiments for the defense of Virginia. The convention also made allowances for a system to clothe, feed, and otherwise supply soldiers during their years of service. And the convention insisted that each common soldier, not already sufficiently provided in the opinion of his commanding officer, shall be provided with sufficient clothing at the expense of the public, to be deducted out of his pay, and also to be allowed by the public a hunting shirt, a pair of leggings, binding for his hat, and also required each soldier to, at the expense of the public, be furnished with each one good musket and bayonet, cartridge box or pouch, and canteen, among other items. To accomplish this and oversee the provision of these goods to the newly established regiments, the convention ordered the Committee of Safety to appoint one or more contractors or commissaries who are hereby required to use all possible dispatch in purchasing such provisions as shall be needed for the Army. Thus was born the Williamsburg Public Store. And the Committee of Safety voted to appoint prominent merchant William Aylett as commissary of purchases for the store, and William Armistead Jr. was selected to act as one of his assistants. Do you see how this is all coming together? Armistead, who likely had considerable connections, or at least a family history of business operations, may have been in Williamsburg as early as 1775, as the New Kent County militia mustered at the capital. Nevertheless, Armistead assisted Aylett until Aylett moved on to run the Southern Department in late 1777. At the ripe old age of 23, William Armistead Jr. was given a promotion and became the new commissary of stores for the Commonwealth of Virginia. Records indicate that William received a salary of £300 per year, plus expenses and expenses for one servant. We believe that that servant was James. And realizing that James was the assistant for William Armistead in the public store, which operated out of Williamsburg until 1780, helped us understand how James may have come to meet the Marquis de Lafayette. As William's servant, James surely would have accompanied him as James coordinated the move, as he coordinated the move of the public store from Williamsburg to Richmond in the late spring and summer of 1780. The historic record indeed notes that most, if not all, of William Armistead's family was living in Richmond and had his slaves with him. 4 of the enslaved were tithable, which means that they were over the age of 16, and one of them may have been James, 32 in 1780. After Armistead, with the assistance of slaves and others, moved the goods and records of the store from Williamsburg to Richmond, shipping them upriver in the schooners the Eastern Shore Betsy and the Peace and Plenty, the business of the public store continued in Richmond, Virginia's new capital, selected because the General Assembly presumed Richmond to be less vulnerable to enemy attack. The General Assembly had good reason to worry. By 1779, the British Army began flirting with the idea of invading Virginia. In May, Admiral George Collier landed his troops in Hampton Roads and sent raiding parties to Portsmouth and Suffolk, destroying warehouses and other important infrastructure in an attempt to cut off commerce with the West Indies. The Virginia Assembly and then Governor Thomas Jefferson felt this was a little too close to Williamsburg's doorstep and voted to move the capital up the James River to Richmond. Predictably, the British followed, and on January 4th, 1781, Benedict Arnold, who had recently turned his loyalties to the British, landed at Westover Plantation with 1,600 troops, including Simcoe's Queen's Rangers and Hessians, to attack Richmond. I'll give this a minute to pass. Though Jefferson called on Patriot forces to repel the attack, they quickly broke at the sight of Arnold's advance. One witness of Arnold's attack wrote that about 200 Virginia militiamen had, quote, assembled on the heights near the venerable meeting house of St. John's Church, and Lieutenant Colonel Simcoe was ordered to dislodge them. But without firing a shot, they fled in confusion when he reached the summit of the hill. Similarly, Johann Ewald, a Hessian involved in the attack, described his role in the advance. To the right lay a very steep hill, overgrown with brushwood, which General Arnold thought was occupied by riflemen. The general pointed there with his hand. "That's a task made for you." I deployed at once, formed 2 ranks well dispersed, and climbed up a hill. The enemy left after a volley which wounded 1 Jaeger. Hiding in Charlottesville, Jefferson refused Arnold's bribe to keep the capital safe in exchange for a price, and on January 6, 1781, Arnold set Richmond ablaze. Now, the destruction of the capital was a heavy blow to the already crippling Virginia economy and its beleaguered forces. On July 18, 1781, William Armistead was accused of neglecting his duties as commissary, and then Governor Thomas Nelson was quick to point out that not least of the sufferers was the Marquis de Lafayette, who, quote, "had nothing but bad whiskey to drink." To compensate for his misfortune, the governor ordered the agent of trade to procure for the Marquis a whole hogshead of spirits for his personal use. So, note to self, complain about bad whiskey and expect a whole barrel of something better in return. To reinforce the patriots during the perilous situation developing in Virginia, General Washington had ordered the Marquis de Lafayette to command the Continental forces in Virginia in February 1781, after Arnold and his Loyalist and Hessian forces ransacked and burnt Richmond. If you're unfamiliar with the Marquis de Lafayette, allow me to introduce him to you now. The Marquis was born into a wealthy, aristocratic family in September 1757 and deeply desired to follow in the footsteps of his family's martial glory. His father had died at the hands of the British, actually more specific at the hands of a British cannonball, at the Battle of Minden in 1759, and some historians have postulated that though Lafayette's near obsession with the ideals of liberty drove him to support the American cause, his eagerness to serve Washington, even without pay, may have also included a desire to return a cannonball back to the British. Well, Lafayette's desire to aid American patriots was met with substantial resistance in France, but once on American soil, in 1777, Lafayette and Washington immediately formed a deep bond. Lafayette first saw battle at Brandywine on September 11, 1777, and was shot in the leg. After he recuperated, he joined Washington's camp at Valley Forge, and shortly thereafter, in March 1778, France signed treaties of amity and commerce with the United States, formally throwing support and soldiers behind the patriot cause. Later that year, Congress granted Lafayette permission to return to France, where he was given a hero's welcome, and of course, after being placed under customary house arrest for disobeying King Louis and going to America in the first place, but this gave him time to father a son, whom he named George Washington Lafayette, so all's well that ends well. Well, Lafayette was hoping to use his time in France to convince King Louis to invade Britain with himself in command, of course. But this idea failed to manifest, and Lafayette turned his attention to securing soldiers and General Rochambeau to fight in America. In March of 1780, Lafayette boarded a little ship called l'Hermione, and I'm sure none of you have heard of that before. And he arrived back in America on April 27th, 1780. Lafayette languished in New Jersey and New York, as you do, with little to no attention and action until Washington ordered Lafayette to round up his troops for Virginia in the early months of 1781, with the clear directive to trap the treacherous Benedict Arnold and deliver him a fate surely worse than death. Actually, just death. Almost immediately after Lafayette's arrival in Virginia, an already bad situation had gotten much worse. By May, General Charles Cornwallis arrived in Petersburg, some 24 miles south of the capital, to join forces with General William Phillips, who arrived in Virginia by way of New York as a result of his capture at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. Either still not 100% sure of Benedict Arnold's endgame, or solely to reinforce the British troops there, Phillips had been sent to rendezvous with Arnold in Virginia. However, Phillips became violently ill, but not before launching a major campaign destroying the Virginia Naval Yard on the Chickahominy River and participating in the attack on Petersburg. Washington sent forces under the command of the Marquis de Lafayette to reinforce the Patriot position there, and Phillips succumbed to his illness, which was most probably malaria, at Petersburg on May 13th, but not before turning all command of his forces to the still alive and not yet on the gallows Benedict Arnold. Now, combined with Cornwallis's men, that's a terrible thing to confuse, Cornwallis's men, the British Army in Virginia numbered some 7,000 seasoned veterans. Cornwallis led this fighting force across the James River to pursue the Marquis de Lafayette, who returned northwards to Fredericksburg to await further reinforcements. But he soon embarked on a plan to parallel Cornwallis's movements, which had turned eastward along the road to New Kent County and Burnt Ordinary, which, if you're familiar with the area, is now Towano. And that action occurred in mid-June. By June 27th, Lafayette was close by, encamped at William Tyree's plantation in New Kent, about 20 miles from Williamsburg. The Marquis wrote to Governor Nelson that on June 23rd, Cornwallis had been at New Kent Courthouse and then Bird's Ordinary and were on their way to Williamsburg, with Colonel Simcoe's Queen's Rangers engaging General Anthony Wayne's line at Spencer's Ordinary. While at Tyree's plantation, Lafayette received word that Cornwallis had received reinforcements from Portsmouth and grew increasingly concerned over his own troop strength, which, once combined with forces under Anthony Wayne and von Steuben, only amassed 1,900 Continentals and 3,000 militia, and that's a far cry from the 7,000-man British force under Arnold and Cornwallis. Well, it's clear that if he wasn't before, Lafayette was now deeply concerned and wanted to maximize the resources at his disposal to give patriots every possible advantage over the enemy in whatever was brewing in Hampton Roads. Lafayette considered raising an additional force of 150 African Americans to precede the main line's advance, in addition to a corps of 100 black wagoners to support the army. And in addition to beefing up his own forces, Lafayette was eager to learn more about Cornwallis's movements and intentions. On July 31st, Lafayette penned a letter to General George Washington. A correspondent of mine, servant to Lord Cornwallis, writes on the 26th of July at Portsmouth and says that his master, Tarleton, and Simcoe are still in town but expect to move. Speaking of Cornwallis, Lafayette added, "His lordship is so shy of his papers that my honest friend says he cannot get at them." In these lines we read our first accounts of the espionage that Lafayette set in motion, which ultimately resulted in the world turned upside down. I want to clarify something here before we continue. Going by just the facts, the historical record does not provide, as I said, much information about James's actual activities as a spy. What we know we can only infer from a handful of documents that survive from the Marquis de Lafayette's correspondence with Washington and James's own post-war petitions for his own liberty and support. I mentioned before that much of what we've come to accept about James and his activities as a spy during the lead-up to the Siege of Yorktown is based on 200 years of conjecture. What you'll hear from me for a while this morning may sound a lot like a bunch of empty qualifiers, like maybe, probably, and could have. And that's because for a lot of this, we just don't know. And we can never know for certain. We just have the documentation and primary source material regarding James's activities. We need that documentation to be a little bit more precise. So please bear with me as we explore James Lafayette through the documentation that we do have and explore him within the contextual bounds of what might have happened. Besides, how many spies really leave a paper trail? Well, we can't say for sure when and where James and the Marquis de Lafayette became acquainted. Perhaps it was in Williamsburg, as James traveled with William Armistead as assistant to the commissary of the public store, or in Richmond, when William became commissary and worked closely with military personnel to supply Virginia forces under the command of the Marquis de Lafayette. As we've seen, Lafayette spent a great deal of time in the spring and summer of 1781 in and around New Kent County, James's own stomping grounds. He may have encountered the Marquis there, James there. But regardless of when or where they became acquainted, James was a willing volunteer to the patriot cause. According to his December 4th, 1784 petition to the Virginia House of Delegates, James was, quote, impelled by a most earnest desire of gaining liberty, which is so near and dear to all mankind, and was convinced that if he rendered any essential services to the public, that would be his reward. James volunteered his services to the Marquis de Lafayette, expecting his own eventual freedom as a result. And James received the permission of his master, William Armistead, at some time before July 1781, and had infiltrated Cornwallis's camp. We don't know for sure under what circumstances James was able to enter the British line. All we know for sure, according to the documentary record, is that he did it. And according to his 1786 petition for freedom, James, described as a slave belonging to William Armistead of New Kent County, entered into the service of the Marquis Lafayette, and during the time of his serving the Marquis, often at the peril of his own life, found means to frequent the British camp. Again, while we don't know for sure, James may have entered enemy lines, possibly under the guise of a forager, collecting and distributing food from the countryside and procuring it for the British headquarters. This cover would allow James seamless, unquestioned, and regular access to British camps. Similarly, James could have also passed himself off as a runaway slave, eager to secure asylum and emancipation by reaching the British camp. Hessian soldier Johann Ewald recalled that by the time the combined British Army reached Yorktown, thousands of runaway slaves had reached their camp, hoping to secure emancipation. James could have easily blended into that population and may have had the freedom of movement that way to pass between both the Patriot and British lines. Maybe referring to James or another spy, Lafayette described an informant as, quote, servant to Cornwallis. It's not uncommon for British soldiers to have body servants in the field. Ewald further recalled that every soldier has his Negro who carried his provisions, and that officers had 3 or 4, as well as 1 or 2 for a cook and maid. If James or another Patriot spy spent any time behind the Patriot lines acting as a servant for Cornwallis, the possibilities of gathering intelligence could be endless. A servant to Cornwallis could have accompanied the general anywhere, viewing the size and condition of troops, supplies, even morale. In Lafayette's letter in which he told Washington of his honest friend, he went on to give us a clue as to how this fellow may have been gathering intelligence. After communicating information to Washington, Lafayette wrote, "My accounts from Portsmouth are later than the fellow's epistle, but as a servant has opportunities to hear, I thought it was worth communicating to your excellency." A servant has opportunities to hear. That's a powerful line in our understanding of how James and others may have gathered intelligence for the Patriot cause. Once a familiar face behind British lines, James could have been present during countless meetings on strategy, overheard informal chit-chat between commanders while he was serving wine or dinner or delivering raw goods and supplies. Who would have paid any attention to the attendant in the corner or the slave walking through camp? And what's more, who would have suspected that James was actively listening, memorizing numbers, directions, or concerns? And who would have guessed that he was literate and could later record his observations and take notes over conversations, perhaps glancing at important papers or charts lying innocently on the general's desk, passing them through a network of espionage carefully orchestrated by Lafayette as he wandered betwixt and between both British and Patriot lines? While we can't say for sure exactly how James functioned in the British camp, he must have gradually become a familiar face, or at least blended into the crowd, hovering under everyone's radar. Hence my alternate title of my talk this morning, Invisible Spy. If James made the British believe that he was beholden to them for his own liberty and freedom, what reason would Cornwallis, or any British soldier for that matter, have to question, even for a moment, James's own loyalty or his presence in the camp? What reason would anyone have to suspect that James may have been a spy, and that his presence in the British camp, let alone in the general's quarters, was anything other than innocent and above board? So we've explored some possibilities of how James may have come by the information that he fed to Lafayette, but the historic record does not reveal how he conveyed his information to the Marquis. It's possible that if he left for foraging or fatigue duties, James could sneak out of the British camp and return to Lafayette himself, relaying information simply by meeting with the Marquis before returning to the British camp. Another likely possibility, however, is that James was an extremely important element in a larger network of espionage that Lafayette orchestrated during the summer and fall of 1781, utilizing both white soldiers and enslaved African Americans to infiltrate the British camp. James may have worked with these compatriots to relay information by passing notes or finding other ways to communicate with each other and the Patriot generals who relied on them for intelligence. One of these compatriots may have been a soldier known in Lafayette's papers simply as Morgan of the New Jersey line. Morgan's story appears as an anecdotal footnote in the compiled Memoirs, Correspondence, and Manuscripts of General Lafayette, Volume 1, first published in New York in 1837. It seems that Lafayette desired a, quote, faithful and intelligent soldier whom he could send into the British camp under the guise as a deserter, who could then ingratiate himself with Cornwallis and feed him false intelligence. Similarly, Saul Matthews, an enslaved African-American serving in Virginia, was sent behind enemy lines by his commander, Colonel Josiah Parker, when Cornwallis's troops occupied Portsmouth. So it's far from the truth to assume that James was the only spy for Lafayette in the Patriot forces, but I, for one, think that this makes a much more interesting story, and I think that Hollywood should pick this up for a major action drama, don't you? James's 1786 testimony of his actions during the war lends credence to the possibility that he acted as a most completely lost my spot. Please talk amongst yourselves. Let's try that sentence again, shall we? James's 1786 testimony of his actions during the war lends credence to the possibility that he acted as a major player in a larger network. According to the document, James repeatedly risked his life to frequent the British camp, by which means he kept open a channel of the most useful communications to the army of the state. And further, that at various times he conveyed enclosures from the Marquis into enemy lines of the most secret and important kind, the possession of which, if discovered on him, would have most certainly endangered his life. Letters from the Marquis de Lafayette to General Washington help us understand the type of information that James was able to gather and relay. In a letter to Washington dated July 31st, 1781, the Marquis wrote from his position at Malvern Hill. Through his correspondent servant to Lord Cornwallis, Lafayette learned that the greatest part of the enemy is embarked. There is a large quantity of Negroes, but it seems no vessel to take them off. What garrison they leave, I do not know. Owing to his spies' espionage, Lafayette continued to Washington. Should a French fleet now come in Hampton Road, the British Army, I think, would be ours. Further, on August 29th, Lafayette wrote to Washington that he received some intelligences by way of the servant I have once mentioned. A very sensible fellow was with him, and from him, as well as deserters, I hear that they begin fortifying at York. Lafayette went on to describe the situation of the British position at Yorktown, enumerating the number and types of vessels the British sailed into the York River, the number of artillery and redoubts across the river at Gloucester, and even the fact that a large number of British soldiers had been ill at Portsmouth, but informed Washington that information gathered from spies and deserters placed Cornwallis's able-bodied fighting force at around 4,500 rank and file. On September 1st, Lafayette reported to Washington that the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse had arrived, and the rest, they say, is history. As Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown on October 19th, 1781, ended his army's campaign in the American Revolution, it also ended James's work as a spy. In all likelihood, after the surrender, James returned to his master, William Armistead, Jr., who was still in Richmond and in charge of the public store. According to the 1782 census taken of the city of Richmond, then 28-year-old Armistead was residing with 20-year-old Susanna Armistead, perhaps his wife or sister, 4 slaves over the age of 16, 3 younger slaves, and 2 horses. After the household left Richmond, James almost certainly would have returned to the Armistead's New Kent County plantation. Perhaps realizing that the institution of slavery was inconsistent with the hard-fought battles for colonial independence from Britain, in 1782, the Virginia General Assembly passed a law that enabled slaveholders to emancipate their slaves. The law enumerated that owners could free slaves either by a bequest or by a deed of manumission formally entered into the records of the county court. Further, in October 1783, Virginia broadened the law to free slaves who had served in the military, citing that anyone who contributed towards the establishment of American liberty and independence should enjoy the blessings of freedom as a reward for their toils. It's important to note for our discussion of James that the 1783 legislation only granted freedom to slaves who enlisted in any regiment or corps raised within the state, or those who had served as a substitute for any free person. Remember that James did not enlist in any regiment or Virginia or militia. He did not wear a uniform, and he did not carry a gun. Though he risked his life in the service of his country, the law did not apply to him. James was not eligible for automatic manumission under this law. However, the law also provided that slaves could be freed by demonstrating that they had performed meritorious service during the war, which is just what James set out to do. If he was still acting as a personal servant, it's likely that James accompanied his master William to Richmond for the assembly session that ran from October 1784 until early January. William had been elected as one of New Kent County's 2 representatives to the Virginia House of Delegates after the war. It's also likely then that James was in Richmond on November 21st, 1784, when the Marquis de Lafayette visited the state capitol. There, Lafayette wrote a testimonial on behalf of James's service to the country. Lafayette wrote, and don't worry, I'm going to read this. No one's had that much coffee yet. This is to certify that the bearer by the name James had done essential services to me while I had the honor to command in this state. His intelligences from the enemy's camp were industriously collected and faithfully delivered. He perfectly acquitted himself with some important commissions I gave him, and appears to me entitled to every reward his situation can admit of. Almost immediately, Lafayette's testimonial of James's meritorious service was received by the House in Richmond. The Journal of the House of Delegates recorded the petition on December 4th. James, a Negro slave, setting forth that being impelled by a most earnest desire of gaining that liberty which is so dear to all mankind, and convinced that if he rendered any essential services to the public that would be his reward, he often, during the invasion of the enemy in 1781, at the risk of his life, entered into the enemy's camp and collected such intelligence as he supposed of importance, and which he conveyed in the utmost expeditious manner to the Marquis de Lafayette, who then commanded the American army in Virginia, and praying that an act may pass for his emancipation, and that a reasonable compensation may be made for him to his present proprietor. Under the provision of providing service to the country during the war, James was formally asking the Virginia House of Delegates for his freedom. Get ready for a shock. In 1784, James did not receive his freedom, and it's unclear why. Either the delegates found some reason to reject the claim, or the petition was tabled to move on to other matters before the House adjourned on January 7th. James had only one option: to try again. This is someone's life we're talking about here. I really want to remind us of that. James submitted another petition in 1786, and in October, the Assembly granted James his freedom. Be it therefore enacted that the said James, from and after the passing of this act, enjoy all freedom as if he had been born free. On February 7th, 1787, Mr. William Clayton of New Kent County was appointed to ascertain and fix the value of said James, and to certify valuation to the Auditor of Accounts. Sometime in the early months of 1787, Clayton determined an appropriate value for James and paid William Armistead Jr. out of the state's general fund. Legislation passed, payment signed, sealed, and delivered, and James was a free man, and the New Kent County tax assessor listed James Fayette as the head of his household. This morning, I am sharing with you for the first time some details about James's life as a free man, carefully uncovered by our research earlier this summer. James was listed in the 1787 tax assessment because now, as a free man, he was responsible for paying personal property taxes on behalf of himself and those that he owed on any other members of his household. The 1787 assessment tells us that his household included 2 slaves aged 16 or older and 1 slave under the age of 16. He also paid taxes on 2 horses, mares, or colts. 1 year later, his assessment included 4 tithable slaves, again, tithable meaning over the age of 16. And the documentary record is silent on how James acquired the money to pay for taxes on these slaves. Virginia manumission laws stated that former slaves who failed to pay their personal property taxes could be hired out until their debt was satisfied, or risk being re-enslaved if they could not pay. While the identities of the slaves on James Fayette's tax assessment are not known, it's possible that they were family. From 1787 until 1804, the number of slaves ebb and flow on his tax assessment, so it's possible that the enslaved members of the household were being employed by whites who then paid their personal property taxes. Interestingly, by 1810, the tax assessor noted that James's household included 11 free blacks in addition to 3 slaves, perhaps indicating that James was allowing others to live on his property. And here's something else that's interesting. In 1813, the tax assessor compiled a list of the free blacks living in New Kent County. He included on his list James Lafayette and his wife. 5 years later, in 1818, Sylvia Lafayette was identified as the free black female head of the household. I got this great email from one of our historians that said her name was Sylvia. It was an amazing moment. You may be asking yourself if James was granted his freedom in 1787 and listed as the head of a household that included individuals listed as slaves, likely children, why would he not grant his children their freedom? It's complicated. Bear with me. James's own manumission occurred at a time when the window to freedom was open for a very short period of time. Remember that the 1622 law, which dictated that the status of the mother is also the status of the child, was still on the books. Therefore, if any children that James and Sylvia had, while Sylvia was a slave, according to the law, were also enslaved. The laws governing free blacks were strict and invasive. As early as 1792, all free blacks were required to register with local officials and were required to pay 25 cents every year for a certificate of registration, which had to be carried on their person at all times. In 1806, the laws grew even more severe. The Virginia legislature did not cease to allow private manumissions, but required that every enslaved African American freed on or after May 1st, 1806, to leave the state within 1 year of manumission, under pain of being re-enslaved. Further, free blacks were heavily taxed, and those who could not pay their taxes ran the risk of being enslaved and could even be re-enslaved if their former owner could not pay their debts. These are the constraints in which newly emancipated James Lafayette found himself. In the early years of 19th century Virginia, I have to wonder, how free was free? In 1816, James appears on the records as owning 40 acres of land that had previously been part of the Philemon Woodward estate. 30 of those acres were Meredith Hilliard's mill pond, abutted Meredith Hilliard's mill pond, and 10 abutted the land of William Tyree. The assessed value of the 30 acres was $41.70, while the remaining 10 was valued at $13.90. Even though he paid taxes on his property, James himself is absent from the New Kent County tax lists from 1817 to 1820, perhaps because he was working for someone else who paid his taxes. Not that New Kent County isn't a bustling metropolis in 2016. It's not like DC, I can tell you. Perhaps from 1817 to 1820, James left the county looking for better opportunities to earn money, perhaps as a domestic servant or as a skilled laborer, maybe even as close as the 2 mill ponds that operated adjacent to his own property line. Though James had ample acreage to farm, by the first quarter of the 19th century, his farmland may have been too nutrient depleted to produce any valuable crop. The New Kent County tax assessor went so far as to describe James's 40 acres as light broken and much worn land. On December 28, 1818, 70-year-old James applied to the Virginia General Assembly for a state pension, citing his aforementioned service to Lafayette during 1781, which he cited was valuable enough to earn him his freedom, for which James's heart, he wrote, will ever be filled with gratitude so long as its blood runs warm. James was getting old and feeling the years creep up to him. He continued that, from a natural decline of his bodily powers, he has for years found it extremely hard to acquire by labor moderate support. And feeling those powers daily to decline, he fears that without assistance he will no longer be able to procure the necessities of life. James further asked for a small pension and signed his name James Lafayette. The Assembly granted James' petition and awarded him a pension of $3.33 a month, or a lump sum of $20 every 6 months. James traveled to Richmond to collect his payment of $20 every 6 months, visiting the state auditor's office and signing his name for his pension, James Fayette. In 1824, an incredible thing happened in the United States. An invitation from President James Monroe, the American people welcomed back the Marquis de Lafayette and relived the patriotic spirit of '76 on the eve of the nation's 50th birthday. The Marquis, now the last surviving general of the American Revolution, embarked on a farewell tour of the country that he so passionately helped to establish. A bona fide rock star, in 1824, Lafayette arrived to an estimated 80,000 screaming fans. Because I never, ever, ever get sick of this analogy, let's take a break for some quick population analysis, shall we? Yep, you're reading that right. Statistically speaking, more people showed up for the arrival of Lafayette in New York in 1824 than when the Beatles showed up in 1964. Who's the rock star now? Well, you're probably wondering what all this has to do with James. Well, news of Lafayette's tour of the United States was widely publicized and greatly anticipated. He had tour stops planned for nearly every Revolutionary War battlefield and every major city in the country and lots of capital cities, with a special stop at the site of the Siege of Yorktown planned for the anniversary of the battle there. James desired to see his old friend one last time, and word got around. In 1824, the Richmond Compiler ran an article under the heading of Veteran Negro and told the story of a very venerable and respected free man named James Lafayette, who occasionally visits the city from one of the adjacent counties to receive his pension. The article recounted how the Marquis had personally attested to James's service in the late war and that James had expressed a great desire to see the Marquis at the approaching festival at Yorktown, but is believed that he is too poor to equip himself for that occasion without some aid. The article continued, "Would not the recognition of this faithful old Negro by our illustrious visitor at the scene of his most former glory be a spectacle worthy to be remembered?" While historians disagree on whether it happened at the celebrations in Yorktown or at Richmond, James got to see his friend one last time. The Richmond Inquirer reported that during one of the parades held in Lafayette's honor, James was, quote, recognized by Lafayette in the crowd, called to him by name, and taken him into his embrace. Combined with the patriotic fervor of the Marquis's visit, James's story had really tugged at the heartstrings of Virginians. It was around this time that Richmond-based artist John Martin preserved James in oil, which you can go visit at the Valentine Museum in Richmond. Martin somehow got a hold of the Marquis's original affidavit written in support of James's petition for manumission in 1784. He reproduced it in bulk, it seems, complete with a black and white engraving of his oil portrait. Martin then sold these handbills, and quite a few of them are floating around in museums and archives around the country. Like his friend the Marquis, James had become somewhat of a folk hero. And the public's fascination with James did not end there. 4 years later, in 1828, James Heath wrote a novel of the American Revolution called Edge Hill. Heath, who served as a state auditor during the years that James received his pension, must have met James when he traveled to his office to collect his dues. Heath and James must have struck up quite a conversation because Heath featured him as a main character in this novel. In the novel, James is a spy for Lafayette, though I doubt little else is based on historical fact. And Heath did include a scene where James is reunited with Lafayette during his farewell tour. We'll never know how accurate any of this is, but just for fun, here are some of my favorite descriptions of James, as included in the novel. Lynx-eyed, swift-footed and patient of fatigue, shrewd and observing, and ladies and gentlemen, my personal favorite, mighty sassy. For all of the public's interest in James during his later years, James died rather obscurely and quietly. He collected his final pension payment on March 19th, 1830, and passed away on August 9th. On April 1st, 1832, Peter Coleman of Baltimore, whom the court described as a respectable free man of color, testified that he was well acquainted with a colored man named James Lafayette, formerly of Richmond, Virginia, and said that James died in the city of Baltimore. We don't know how James died in Baltimore, when he went there, or why. Someone was granted the $16 balance on his pension, but we don't know who. And while the tax assessor credited James's 40 acres and $20 worth of improvements on his estate until 1836, the next year, the property had been transferred to James Parkinson of Richmond by James Lafayette's legatees. The property continued to be attributed to Parkinson and his estate through the 19th century. And with that, the documentary record of James Lafayette, his contributions to American independence at Yorktown, and his special relationship with the Marquis runs cold. But happily, his legacy continues today. As I mentioned previously, thanks to the wonderful research we now have about James Lafayette, he'll be featured in the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown's inaugural changing exhibition, Afterward, the Revolutionary Veterans Who Built America. as I said, opening June 2017. The exhibit will tell the surprising stories of the veterans of the Siege of Yorktown and their contributions to the American evolution after the American Revolution. The exhibit follows closely our mission at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown to tell the real-life personal stories of ordinary men and women like James who risked everything for the pursuit of liberty, their country's, but often their own. We're gathered together today, all because of the heroism, patriotism, and acts of daring do committed by real people like James Lafayette. And through careful research and engaging and illuminating interpretation, we can make sure that he, along with his contributions to the American Revolution, is no longer invisible. Thank you very much.
And now the fun part begins. So I want to ask you the first question, and then we'll open up to the audience. It's something I don't think you addressed quite enough during this talk, and I think we need to make sure that we touch upon this. When does the museum open?
Let me just make sure everyone can hear. October 15th, 2016. A few short weeks from now.
Right, exactly. All right. That's my only question. I just wanted to make sure it was completely understood.
Thank you.
So
I'll pay you later for that.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
So we do have several mics moving around, so I'll cover the front.
I'll take the second
Yes, sir.
question. Great talk, Kate. Thank you for sharing your
for having me.
breaking research. It's fun to get breaking news from a couple of centuries ago. We talked on the phone about the interesting thing, why not volunteer for the British if they're going to free you? That interesting point, and then instead stick with the patriots and then have to petition for freedom. Could you possibly address that?
Sure, and I'm very careful that I don't want to put words in James's mouth, because we do know that he said in his application for manumission that he volunteered to join the service of the Marquis de Lafayette because he understood somehow that his own freedom and his own liberty would be his reward. So at some point, I think there had to have been some kind of understanding or conversation that occurred there. But I also want to remind everybody, as I know we all know, that the conclusion of this war, like I said before, hindsight is 20/20. They didn't have that. None of this was a foregone conclusion that the Patriots were going to win. It really could have happened either way, especially in 1781 when James really kind of gets into it with the Marquis and gets involved in the Patriot cause. Things were not looking super awesome. Like I said, the British had 7,000 just in Hampton Roads. The Marquis and the American forces did not quite have that. So it really could have gone either way, and I think that James may have just had this relationship, may have had something to do with his service with the public store, first in Williamsburg and then in Richmond. Maybe he had some kind of internal notion that this is how he felt, or that this was just his best bet at gaining his freedom. And also the British had suffered quite terribly. The enslaved African Americans who had run to the British after the Phillipsburg Proclamation, they had suffered horribly, and many of them had smallpox, had died of smallpox, and had been completely turned out by Cornwallis's army by the time they got to Yorktown. And as my quote from Johann Ewald said, there were thousands of former slaves that had run to Cornwallis just at Yorktown, and they were turning them out because they couldn't support them any better than they could support their own soldiers.
The British, as a tactic in the war, promised freedom to the slaves who would abscond, but and then we cited the fact that they were playing this game in the Declaration of Independence as one of the reasons why we wanted independence.
Absolutely.
And obviously it led to the South joining the Revolution. So the question is whether or not this was truly, and this was before they had emancipation in England in general for slaves. The question is whether or not this tactic on their part was truly counterproductive. It obviously was not enough to get James Lafayette to side with the British. He was playing his angle to get freedom from the Americans if they won. But I mean, overall, was this tactic on promising freedom, which led to lots of African Americans going to Halifax and then to Africa. And I mean, this is a crazy story. But whether this was truly counterproductive for the British to have ever played this game in the first place.
Wow. There's a really great book that talks about the patriot angle to that. It's Woody Holton wrote a really great book called Forced Founders that talks a lot about this. And I wonder if he's also referenced the the British side, again, Dunmore's proclamation was really instrumental in Virginia. He proclaims in, I think it's November 1st of 1775, that any enslaved or indentured servant of a rebel patriot who found his way to the British lines would be freed. And that's pretty early. And then you have the Phillipsburg Proclamation, and you have again, like I mentioned, all of these enslaved African Americans running to the British lines. And I think you're probably right that it was probably counterproductive because there's a huge supply problem. As I mentioned before, by 1781, the slaves who reach Cornwallis are just being turned away, or just being left and deserted to their own means. So I'm not sure that this was really thought out. How are we going to support this population? What are they going to do for us? Are we going to treat them the same way that we're treating our own rank and file? So I think there are some complicated follow-up questions there, and we'll have to see if we can find better answers for that.
Right here.
A wonderful talk. Is there any
Thank you.
record of comparable spying for the British by escaped slaves? Surely this must have happened, but I've never heard of it before.
I have to admit that wasn't part of my research for this particular talk. I would love to see if I can find the answer to that question for you. I'm sure that there were. But again, just a little bit outside of the scope. I was more focused on how does James fit within the broader network and the patriot lines, and how was Lafayette using people like James for espionage. But I didn't look at the flip side of that, so I'm happy to look that up, and we can chat more about that.
Thank you again, an excellent talk.
Thank you.
Thanks for the preparation. You mentioned that his wife's name was Sylvia.
Mm-hmm.
And at least for the first few years, their children were slaves. Did they continue to be slaves, or was he paying taxes on his kids because
Sure.
they were slaves?
Well, we don't know for sure if the slaves that are under 16 and therefore untithable, or over 16 and tithable, we don't know for sure that those were children. We think that they may be, but just like with anything else, we can't say absolutely for sure. And the best that we can do is follow up with the tax assessor's records and just note that those how those numbers progress for who he is paying taxes on and who he's not. And like I mentioned, those numbers ebb and flow. And at some cases that number goes down, in some cases the number goes up, as far as the tithables listed as part of his household. So I'm afraid that we may never know the answer to that question. We do know, at some point, the estate, his estate, when he passes away, goes to someone. It says his legatees, so whoever is managing his estate after his death. We tried to follow up with some genealogy to see if he did have children. We can't find anybody in the historic record with the last name Lafayette or Fayette. He most frequently referred to his own last name as Fayette himself, while everybody else seemed to have included that law and mentioned him as Lafayette. So we searched Fayette, Lafayette to really see where his descendants went, what became of them, if anything, and like I said, the trail ran cold, unfortunately.
Yes, once again, an excellent talk.
Thank you.
I may have misunderstood the name that you said, but it sounded to me like the land that James Lafayette had was adjacent to or part of it was a Tyre or the
William Tyree.
Tyree.
Mm-hmm.
The plantation where Marquis de Lafayette was headquartered. And so did the Marquis have any influence on, have you been able to find that he had any influence on James Lafayette getting that land?
I can assure you, these are all fantastic questions that I desperately wish I had the answer to. But again, I can only respond to what the documentary record shows, and we don't have that information. This is the same. You're right. It's the same neighborhood, if you will, where the Marquis spent a lot of time in the summer of 1780, 1781. So. We also think that it was close to William Armistead. There's some other secondary research out there that suggests that maybe the property line abutted the plantation or the lots that James may have grown up on. So I think we need to do a little bit more research into the lot lines of New Kent County. But guess what? New Kent County was a burned county. So thank all of your Civil War buffs for that. So we don't have a lot of documentary evidence for a lot of things that would answer these questions.
Yeah, we've certainly seen during the Civil War that the Confederacy enormously underestimated the degree to which blacks were sources of intelligence for the Union side. To what extent did the British regard blacks? In other words, you know, in any conflict, someone caught spying would be hanged. And I'm just interested, what do we know about the degree to which the British forces or the British came to suspect blacks were spies for the rebels? In other words, he, as you know, I don't know how he posed, but he was in there. He was black. He was repeatedly in there.
Right.
Why wouldn't he fall under suspicion? I mean, that's sort of a question that comes to you.
Well, the way I look at it, again, going back to that idea of being invisible, and that idea that, you know, if you are an officer, you are used to having these people around you, serving you. You know, may have grown up that way, and I think that just because of kind of the stereotype of his race and his position, I really don't think that there was a lot to give suspicion to his presence in a camp or in a headquarters or being close to Cornwallis's papers. There's some secondary research that suggests that maybe not James, but maybe somebody else, another African American posing as a servant in Cornwallis's quarters, was able to rifle through some papers. We have that really great quote that says that you know, he guards his papers very closely and it's difficult to get at them, which leads me to believe that there's somebody in Cornwallis's camp actually trying to get at his papers. I'm not sure that Cornwallis or anyone else would look and say, hey, I wonder if they're reading those. I wonder what they're looking for. I wonder if they're, I just think that just the nature of who James was and people like him, I think that he really flew under that radar. But that may be a broader question for espionage that's a little bit outside of my own wheelhouse that we can answer, but maybe.
Question on your museum, and when was that opening again?
You'd think I planted these people in the audience. We have a soft opening on October 15th of this year, and then we have grand opening festivities in the spring. But our soft opening is the weekend right before Yorktown Day, conveniently, on October 15th and 16th. And we are if I didn't mention, we're the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. We're actually state. We have a state arm, and we operate the Jamestown Settlement in Jamestown, and we have the 3 beautiful recreated ships, 17th century ships, and we were the Yorktown Victory Center, but we're transitioning from the Yorktown Victory Center to the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown on that weekend of October 15th and 16th, and I hope we see you all down there.
Thank you. I have one general question about things that don't get sometimes seen, and that is, are we finally going to recognize the key contribution the French played at Yorktown? That's always seemed to be downplayed.
As in,
there were 50% of the troops, 100% of the ships.
I invite you to explore that more at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown, October 15th and 16th. Yes, the French are an incredibly important part of our story, the French contribution to the war, and we do spend quite a bit of our 22,000 square foot permanent gallery discussing that story, and not just the lead up to the Siege of Yorktown, but French culture and what's the word I'm looking for? Other contributions as well. So I invite you to come see us and learn more about that.
Why don't we go right here, Amanda?
You mentioned that he had got permission from William Armistead to work for Lafayette. So I'm wondering, is there any indication that that William supported this bid for freedom?
Mm-hmm. Well, William did for James's freedom, or James's own personal freedom, not patriot. Okay. The best way I can answer your question is to remember that James was compensated. I'm sorry, William Armistead Jr. was compensated for the loss of James when James's freedom was finally granted by the Commonwealth, by the state. They sent, essentially an assessor to deem the appropriate value of James at the time of his emancipation, and then William, his former owner, was paid out of the state general funds. So whether or not he supported the loss of James on a more emotional level or maybe intellectual level, he was still paid for it. James was property.
Great talk, Kate.
Thanks, Chuck.
I want to borrow that Beatles slide if I could. Can you tell us the other individuals you're going to highlight in the Changing exhibition coming up later this year, please?
I swear I didn't. Chuck is here on his own volition. Oh, how do I know your name? Sure. So in June of 2017, we're opening a 5,000 square foot special exhibition in our new museum, and it's called Afterward, The American Revolutions Who Built America. And with James Lafayette, we're highlighting other important veterans of the Siege of Yorktown. Let me see if I can get all these. The Marquis de Lafayette is an important one. Henry Knox is an important one. I'm sorry, how can I forget? Alexander Hamilton. And everyone in this room is welcome that I did not just try to sing that line, because that just went right through my head. So again, the story is going to tell, or the exhibit is going to tell some surprising stories about the veterans that you thought that you knew, and look at them through the lens of their lives as veterans. Because what happens when you walk off the battlefield, your life is not over, your contributions are not over, but you continue to bring everything that you brought to that battlefield that continues to play an important role in your life and in the growth of our nation. So something that we're really excited to do is to expand our chronology as an institution. The permanent gallery is going to take you up to about 1790, the first federal census. But Afterward is going to take it all the way to present day, and we're excited to talk about something called the Lafayette Escadrille. You may be familiar with from World War I, and so really being able to make those connections between the past and present and show you that the American Revolution and the war that was fought by these very important veterans, you are part of that legacy today, and we see that legacy all around us today. So we invite you to come after you check out the soft opening in October. We invite you to come back and check out the new 5,000 square foot exhibit in June. Thank you. Great question.
You mentioned that 100% of the ships for the revolution were French, but the Continental Congress did authorize a revolutionary navy during the Revolutionary War, and I was wondering to what extent is the U.S. Navy historically dependent on and grateful to the French Navy for de grâce at Yorktown?
I'm trying to remember where in my talk I may have mentioned, other than that de Grasse did bring his French ships. So we have to credit Henry Knox, actually, for, I think, the real development of the United States Navy after the American Revolution, and commissioning ships, where the United States really started to become a naval power. But we didn't have, I don't know if I'm answering your question very well, but we didn't have quite the naval power that we do today. Absolutely, but there was I think I know what you're referring to now. I talked about the naval stores, that we did have naval stores, we did have ships, but not something like the United States Navy today. Yeah.
And then we'll sit back.
Thank you. Excellent talk. I'm sure you're aware, and everybody in this room is aware, and another shameless plug, this weekend we just inaugurated the Museum of African American History and Culture, and an observation is whether you plan to share with them this research and have an interested audience there as well.
Well, we'd love to. If you have a business card that you could float in my direction, Yes, we'd love to. I think that collaboration amongst institutions like what we're doing today with the Spy Museum is important for everyone. And while we technically own this research, this is everyone's legacy. This is everyone's story. And I think that we're all just mutually excited to interpret it and to use it in our own interpretations of our own missions as well. So be happy to continue the conversation with other institutions for sure.
And if they don't want to tell the story, we will happy to.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good point, is that I hope I'm not speaking out of turn that the International Spy Museum is going to feature James Lafayette in their new installation as well. So again,
Opening summer 2018.
Yeah, or late spring, or who the...
What, Amanda?
God willing, God
Yeah.
willing.
Amanda, I didn't hear you. When was that?
Let's call it late spring.
Yeah,
2018.
late spring, yeah, 2018.
Yeah. Do you want to go right there and then come back here? Yeah.
The information that Fayette passed on, would any of it been written, coded, or strictly verbal?
I have to get back to that slide that says just the facts. We don't know. Again, there's some secondary source information that suggests that maybe things are written down and passed. And again, I can go back and read if I can find it, and who knows what order. Here we go, as things are falling off of the podium. Who knows what order my papers are in now? But Lafayette does say that that James. It was very likely that James could have been found with communication on his person. So that leads me to infer that maybe he did have something written down. I don't know if it was coded or in what manner it was written. But that does lead me to believe that there was some kind of physical something that he was physically passing to other, I don't want to say agents, to other actors. Or to other leaders. So.
A correction about, or just an amplification about the U.S. Navy.
Oh, please.
The Coast Guard was founded in 1790 by Alexander Hamilton. We are the second oldest continuous naval service next to the Marine Corps. The Navy were generally come latelys, I think, under Jefferson.
I think you two should probably go have lunch. Yes. I encourage that conversation to continue.
Boxing ring. So we have time for one more, and let's go to Alexis in the back.
Hi, that signature.
Mm-hmm.
When does that date from? It's later, right? It's in the 1820s or something. It's from one of the petitions. So.
Okay.
So that.
Let me find my transcription of this, just so I'm not steering you wrong. But I believe this is from when he collected one of his pensions.
Right.
So after 1818. Does that say? Yep. There it is. It's right at the top.
So that for you is an indication that he was literate.
Yeah.
And I just wondered how. Because that has bearing on his being a spy and what he might have been able to actually do.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I'm wondering how unusual is that
Mm-hmm.
for this period that he would have been literate. We know he could sign his name, or we know that by 1822 he was literate.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
And put that in context about how unusual that was.
Right. So sure. So like I said, it actually wasn't illegal for someone who was enslaved to be taught how to read or write until 1819. So it's actually not that uncommon for someone at James's age to be literate. We also know, because we went back and we saw that James was helping his master William in the public store, and I should also mention, that's kind of my pet project that I started years and years and years and years and years ago when I was still at Colonial Williamsburg. So it was really interesting to me that these two research questions just kind of exploded together. Part of what I've done as a library fellow at Colonial Williamsburg was to start transcribing the records and records and records and records of the Williamsburg Public Store. So the paper trail for the transactions of supplying Virginia's troops during the American Revolution is endless. I can stand up here and tell you it's endless. I'll never be done with this project. And because of that paper trail, and we see that James was acting as a servant to William while he's procuring these supplies and then writing receipts for supplies and taking care of, there's a journal, there's a day book, there's a cash book, there's a ledger for every year that the store was in operation. So I think that James being literate is indicative of who he's working with and where he's working and how he's assisting his owner. The Armisteds are prolific. Go on to history.org, which is Colonial Williamsburg's website. Navigate through all of that and find the Virginia Gazette. And just look at all of the advertisements and all of the notes that are in the Virginia Gazette from the Armistead family. There are a couple different branches of the Armistead family, but just look at William Armistead Jr. Prolific in the mercantile business. And so we think, again, if James wasn't originally owned by William, which we know that he probably wasn't, he's older than William, it's likely that he's assisting another member of the family who is involved in all of these activities, which would really, really help if they had somebody that could read and write. So I hope that's enough of a contextualization for you, and it's really, at this particular time period, it's really not all of that uncommon for him to know how to read and write.
So let me wrap this up by commending you and your colleagues for the kind of work that you're doing there. It's hard enough to get current information, or even from the last 20, 30 years on intelligence operations. A lot of stuff's not written down, and even the things that are may be misleading, et cetera. So we've been looking at Armistead now for quite some time, and it's nice to see there's some new information out there. This story is as sexy as it ever was, a double agent or not, so we're happy to see that. So kudos to what you've done and what your colleagues are doing there as well. So please join me in thanking Kate Gruber for the time she's taken today.